Welcome to our speaker, Keith Leonard. The topic that he will be presenting on this evening is the public life of African American poets. Thank you for being with us tonight, Keith. I'm going to turn off my video and mute myself and hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me set up my presentation and we will get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me. And thank you for the Arlington Public Library for extending the invitation. I'm grateful for the opportunity to think out loud with you about the important and affirming role that poetry and poets play in our cultural life. I was inspired to focus on today's topic, the public life of African American poets, by Amanda Gorman's quote. Watching the inauguration, I was stunned by the boldness of the bright yellow on that august occasion. Here she was, speaking at a presidential inauguration where most of the men present were in black or blue suits with roughly the same tie palette. Here she was, holding forth in a national space in which an African-American president had been chastised in some quarters for having the temerity to wear a brown suit. I wondered what thought process had gone into the selection of that outfit, given how clear it was that Gorman was well aware not only of the tense politics of our moment, but also of the kind of scrutiny that African-American women must confront in public, a scrutiny that has long taken the form of symbols of incompetence and hypersexuality, both of which are often tied to the brightness of the clothing that some women dared to wear. I have since learned that Gorman's favorite color was yellow long before that moment, and that when Jill Biden first encountered Gorman, she was wearing yellow. I've since learned that 5 days before the inauguration, Gorman contacted someone she knew from Prada to request an outfit, having garnered such a contact after being selected the first Youth Poet Laureate. I've also since learned that the tiara she wore was designed to be a headband, but her mother urged her to wear it like a crown. And Gorman told Vogue writer Doreen St. Felix that fashion is, quote, my way to lean into the history that came before me and all the people supporting me. The boldness of her fashion choices seemed to me to amplify the optimism of human agency that she evinced in her poem, The Hills We Climb. She used that coat and that line about her being a skinny Black girl to locate herself affirmatively in history. She took hold of all the modes of public scrutiny and turned them into a praise song, not only for a possible nation, but also for what an African-American poet can do to change the history of that nation. This was for me an apotheosis of the defining condition of being a Black poet in the United States, which is always to be on stage. Her poem partook of the public rhetoric about democracy and its histories and compromises appropriate for the occasion, and she roused her audience with generous "we," with she addressed us, and with those elegant hand gestures in that yellow coat that signified how her bodily movement was a part of the means by which we climbed those hills. Her public life is obvious. But I was reminded about how similar considerations about the meaning of one's body and dress can weigh on any African-American poet, even when writing quiet meditations on lost love or the grief for a departed parent. Throughout the history of Africans publishing writing about whether or not Africans had the capacity for such expression as for its artistic achievement. In this long and sordid history of literary criticism as sociology, critics have taken it as an article of truth that the personal lives of African-American people are somehow not proper subjects for poetry. One can see stark examples of such priorities in the allegedly complimentary commentary on the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks, for example, the first African-American poet to win a Pulitzer Prize. Poet Lewis Simpson, who Brooks affirmed was a very nice man, thought he was complimenting Brooks when he said, quote, I am not sure it is possible for a Negro to write well without making us aware he is a Negro. On the other hand, if being a Negro is the only subject, the writing is not important. Apparently, Brooks had managed to write on more important subjects. Critic Harvey Curtis Webster made Simpson's logic explicit, concluding that Brooks, quote, refuses to let Negroness limit her humanity. In case you wonder if these principles still hold, you can check out honored critic Helen Vendler's almost dismissive review of Rita Dove's editing of the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry, in which Vendler challenged whether the writers of color included, with their, quote, angry outbursts, were ones we should remember. Somehow such critics as these have concluded that whatever they mean by Negro is opposed to whatever they mean by human. Negro seems only to indicate the public debates of race politics motivated by skin color and hair texture and nothing more. In the 1920s, poet Langston Hughes called this problem the racial mountain, the cultural incentives for self-effacement caused by, quote, an undertow of sharp criticism and misunderstanding from his own group and unintentional bribes from whites. In the late 1960s, Addison Gale measured the force of these incentives, what he called cultural strangulation, as, quote, the extent to which white critics have been allowed to define the terms in which the Black artist will deal with his own experience. I remember a mentor of mine in graduate school declaring that Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize was political. Toni Morrison. Such observations seem to say that whatever is literary does not exist in Black life, that Black life is entirely political. This is tantamount to saying that Black people do not exist. What I want to do with you this evening is to trace the contours and the social force of this dehumanizing cultural sensibility, and to identify what beautiful and empowering artistic lives and poetic works that African-American poets have generated nonetheless. I want to lay out the challenge that obviously accrues when one writes from a position of presumed non-existence, of a presumption that your practice of poetry can matter only if it achieves senses of beauty and emotional insight somehow distinct from your social and emotional life as a Black person, where your, quote, angry outbursts, to borrow from Wendler, are opposed to, quote, artistically ambitious meditations. I want to share readings of two contemporary African-American poets, Patricia Smith and Evie Shockley, to explore how they have adapted different kinds of poetry rooted in so-called angry outbursts to the task of affirming the fullness of Black existence within and against this exclusionary heritage of Anglo-American poetics. I've chosen these two because they were runners-up for the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, a fact that sometimes that is sometimes dubious, but is always a complex and genuine validation for how each in her own way meaningfully and effectively confronted the ways in which the public language on racial difference has informed the public language on the nature, meaning, and value of poetry. What I hope to convey is my sense of the ways in which the human life of African-American people gets conveyed powerfully in verse in ways sometimes unacknowledged because we are not always trained to read it that well, and how African-American writers have of necessity and with great genius navigated such tensions that racial ideology has falsely imposed between individual and collective self-revelation. Our lives are not only public or political, in other words, but navigating the enforced publicity of our private lives has required kinds of innovation, both subtle and stark. I honor these poets' refusal of the social and cultural erasure that our enforced public lives sometimes entail. In our times that will hopefully be a genuine racial reckoning, I can think of no greater argument for the importance of poetry than how Black people have used it to insist on our very existence as if our lives depended on it, because sometimes they do. Let's start by outlining the problem, which has more to do with how people read poetry than with how African-American poets write it. I agree with scholar Kevin Quashie that too often when we talk about Black life, we prioritize these public forms over the fullness of our private lives. Many a Black person can attest to lifelong burdens that many of us have experienced in the face of this priority. We can recall the advice we got from a parent, a grandparent, an auntie, an older cousin, or maybe just the neighborhood oracle about how necessary it is to be aware of how you are perceived. Indeed, there have been many articles in many media outlets recently that have described the talk, and not the talk about the birds and the bees, but about how to handle encounters with the police when you are Black. We know how Trayvon Martin's hoodie led him to be perceived. We know how Renisha McBride was perceived when she crashed her car in the middle of the night and she knocked on that door, getting a shotgun blast for her trouble. In response to such dangerous misperceptions, some of us were raised to speak in standard English, or to dress in clean or even fancy clothes, to tone down or amp up the colors we wear. People have spoken quite well about the political stakes of how Sidney Poitier carried himself, or the social motivations behind Dolores Tucker's desire to censor rap music. Art and culture by and about African Americans is too often read for how positively it portrays Black people, or for some sociological insight into collective Black life. But as Quashie observes, quote, "This is the politics of representation, where Black subjectivity exists for its social and political meaningfulness, rather than as a marker of the human individuality of the person who is Black. As an identity, Blackness is always supposed to tell us something about race or racism, or about America, or violence and struggle and triumph, or poverty and hope. Kwashi's point is not that Black identity does not tell us about these matters. Rather, he is questioning a point of emphasis, of priority, and exploring the consequences of that emphasis. What we can be missing is what Kwashi calls quiet, which is a metaphor he offers for the full range of one's inner life, one's desires, ambitions, hungers, vulnerabilities, fears. The inner life is not apolitical or without social value, but neither is it determined by publicness. In fact, the interior, dynamic and ravishing, is a stay against the dominance of the social world. It has its own sovereignty. One of the great beauties of much African-American poetry to me, even in those angry outbursts, is how it confronts the challenge of conveying this dynamic and ravishing quiet in the language of a poetic tradition and a racial heritage that masks, when it does not erase altogether, that interior life. Enslaved poet Phyllis Wheatley exemplifies what happens to your art and your emotional life when you as an artist are read only as a public figure. Let's try to imagine what it must have felt like for the 14 or 15 or 16-year-old Phyllis to have to prove to governing dignitaries in 18th century Boston that she was smart enough to write the poems published under her name. How might you have understood yourself if you were, like her, enslaved by John and Susanna Wheatley and came to be known among the Wheatley social circle as a particularly gifted African who writes verse? We know that a large proportion of the poems eventually published in the 1773 book Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, were occasional poems, much like The Hills We Climb. In Wheatley's case, they were verse written upon the death of a friend of the Wheatleys, or upon the graduation of students from Harvard College, or the appointment of the Earl of Dartmouth as governor. Wheatley performed as a novelty, we know, even gaining audience with George Washington for a poem she wrote in his honor. Moreover, the predominant poetic style of the day urged poets to downplay the personal in favor of capturing ideals of social norms and philosophical ideals. So we do not have much sense from her poetry what Phyllis thought about being used as something of a political football. Proof to some that Africans were fully human and worthy of being liberated from enslavement, while proof to others, like Thomas Jefferson, that Africans were capable only of imitating, not mastering, Western culture. Think of it. Every time you wrote a poem, people wondered if you were human. Think of the urgency that shaped your poetic choices, what you would, and especially what you would not choose to put in your poems. One can imagine that Wheatley perceived the contradiction between her celebrity and her enslaved status, but there are but 2 or 3 mentions of her condition in all of her poems. Who knows what consequences might have arisen had she written too frankly about how she hated being a slave. But the absence of those lines led the 1960s radicals who created Black studies in the university to treat Wheatley with suspicion, if not with scorn. And in her day, as I mentioned, skeptics like Jefferson did not believe she had a substantive emotional life at all. I don't want to overstate the case, but my point is that this kind of burden remains, this challenge to navigate how often your fellow citizens, even highly educated scholars like Wendler, question the validity of your experience and emotion, challenge whether your emotional life is appropriate for art, and do not challenge their own assumptions and criteria in doing so. Often when I teach Wheatley's poems to my students, I urge them to consider how Henry Louis Gates Jr. poses the question that Wheatley's situation exemplifies. How can the Black subject posit a full and sufficient self in a language in which Blackness is a sign of absence? Even the English language has in its vocabulary and grammar a disdain for Blackness, from images of evil villains to figures of fear and absence. How can Wheatley, she of dark brown skin, write comfortably of the heaven she celebrates in most of her elegies when those angels are figured as white? Indeed, Jefferson called Black skin, quote, an eternal monotony that reigns in the countenances, end quote, of Black people, preventing one from reading their emotions in blushes like you can with white people, and thus implying that Black folks did not have the rationality or imagination or emotional life necessary to be incorporated into the state. Wheatley, like all Africans, was all body to him, all public racial discourse, not the quiet of her inner life. If this is your language, what can you say about yourself? It makes sense to me that some scholars liken the reduction of Black selfhood to the body and its public stereotypes to a kind of social death, that a bridging of social recognition necessary to be incorporated into the society as a person or a citizen. We know that Orlando Patterson popularized that term by declaring it to be the feature common to all practices of enslavement throughout human history. And thanks to Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton and Saida Hartman, to name a few, we know that social death also explains features of our current society. These scholars demonstrate how intellectuals such as Jefferson and Hegel and Kant actively define their key ideas of personhood and citizenship by explicitly excluding Africans from their definitions. Our entire heritage of terms for freedom and personhood, life and liberty have been promulgated based on the idea that Blackness and Black people constitute the absolute. If the foundation of selfhood is the relation between a self as a subject and an other as an object against which the self comprehends its own coherence, then Blackness becomes the necessary object by which the Enlightenment subject gains that coherence. Wilderson and Sexton have concluded that anti-Blackness of this kind is therefore absolutely inextricable from Western thought. The Black body becomes that which illuminates the Western mind, the savage that clarifies Western civilization, the scapegoat that must be expunged through lynching and segregation and mass incarceration. As Saida Hartman put it, if slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. Access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. Like Kwashi, I balk at the extremity of these arguments, but I cannot help but recognize why they have such force. They help to explain the remarkable persistence of the reduction of Black people to public misperceptions and the public comfort with the violence against Black bodies. I find myself in the camp of scholars seeking to adapt these terms to explain the empowering urgency of Black cultural expression that defies this social death. For example, Christina Sharp suggests that accepting these dark premises opens up new ways of honoring Black life. Quote, that it, anti-Blackness, is the ground, lays out that, and perhaps how, we might begin to live in relation to this requirement for our death. What kinds of possibilities for rupture might open up? She claims to be, quote, interested in the ways of seeing and imagining responses to the terror visited upon Black life and the ways we inhabit it, are inhabited by it, and refuse it. It is the refusal that interests me most. Calling the afterlives of slavery's foundational anti-Blackness awake, Sharp concludes that we, Black people, everywhere and anywhere we are, still produce in, into, and through the wake an insistence on existing. We insist Black being into the wake. Our very living may be our most fundamental refusal, in other words, our fullest rejection of cultural non-existence. As poet and scholar Fred Moten declares, quote, what is at stake is a fugitive movement in and out of the frame, bar, or whatever externally imposed social logic, a movement of escape, the stealth of the stolen that can be said, since it inheres in every closed circle, to break every enclosure. In other words, like Sharp, Moten sees the idea of Blackness as absolute other to be productive of an excess to the system in which it is supposed to be a boundary. It becomes not just the end or boundary of one system of knowing that elevates the white Enlightenment self, it is also the beginning of another system of self-knowing outside of that self-other framework, offering what Moten calls, quote, some sense of the fugitive law of movement that makes Black social life ungovernable. Insisting on our existence in language in which Blackness is a sign of absence or otherness produces social lives that exceed the roles that we, like Wheatley, are often forced to play. I like this idea that Blackness flourishes as a kind of excess to the limiting languages and logics of race, and it seems that many of our poets do too. In the case of Smith and Shockley, as Nicole Fleetwood urges, quote, we should focus on Black female cultural producers' engagement with the imago of Black female excessiveness in order to recognize how they articulate an existence beyond it. Like Quashie and Sharp suggest, let's attend to Black being, both noun and verb. For her part, Smith distinguishes her verse by translating the political and performative sensibilities of spoken word poetry, that genre of angry outbursts, to the page in ways that center Black women's perspectives on Black existence. Here's one of the spoken word performances through which Smith articulates one key motivation for her writing of poetry. Smith is calling on poets to build Nicole's mother because that requires those poets to engage with the difficulties of life that led Smith's sixth grade students all to know someone who died. Building Nicole's mother is thus unearthing or salvaging from the language of absence, from the practices of social death, some nurturing heritage, even if it is created by that verse, insisted upon in defiance of the limits of the ideas and language that the poets have at their disposal. I think we are meant to recognize the kind of beauty where we wouldn't expect it in that empty vessel, a beauty that exceeds the horrors that warps the lives of these children, renders them invisible even to themselves, but that something also escapes and endures, something fugitive, that is the fullness of their being, articulated in their desperate thirst for words, for their poetry. One can see an elaboration on this urgent call in Smith's book. When Smith discussed writing incendiary art and interviews, she declared that she and others have found turning to poetry for truth, that for her, writing poetry was a way, quote, to ground myself in the world. She also said, quote, I always tell my students to look for the voice that they are not hearing. And for her, in the time that she wrote her book, it was the mothers who died, the mothers of those who had died violently in the streets. She wanted to confront what it must have felt like losing your child so publicly, in some instances too, and then having that child be railroaded or stereotyped in all kinds of ways. So I started with that. As for the title of the book, Smith declared that it came in part from hearing someone at a Trump rally at the 2016 campaign declare that he would like to burn a Black person. That got her thinking about fire, about burning down neighborhoods like Tulsa and the burnings of lynchings. According to Smith, quote, I thought, I need to stand in the center of the fire for a while and see. And part of what she saw, it seems, was the wounded and even mangled quiet of Black life insisting in and through its wounds to build some kind of sovereignty. Take Incendiary Art, Chicago, 1968, as an example.
Incendiary Art, Chicago, 1968. Nobody expected Goldblatt's to burn so fast. Heard it said the store was flat before Martin's blood was cold. A damning stink turned the air toxic. Dacron, plastic necklaces and earbobs, rose-dotted acrylic Easter cardigans, reams of forged patent leather, mirrored shadow boxes, hundreds upon hundreds of knockoff Barbies, flinty breasts still perked past combustion, shiny cardboard living room suites sloshed in wood hues, stacked cartons crammed with eerily patient layaway tickets. Who knew our pudgy American dream was so combustible? Anyone could read the mind of the young boy careening down Madison Street, rapidly clutching a coveted pair of what he was convinced were Converse All-Stars. Sneaks, clearly on fire. Run some hot water in the sink, put a little Tide on the washcloth, wipe all the burnt off, these gonna be all right. The shoes sizzled in the moonwash, badass light lapping the laces. Later, he saw that one shoe was blue, the other red. And shit, they were different sizes. Folding his feet inside, he wore them anyway, stumbling into daybreak, trailing tendrils of smoke. Spouting conquest amid the reeking ruins, he limped with conjured pride, careful to hide his raw and swollen hands.
The poet clearly knows that not anyone can read his mind. A Chicago native herself, Smith clearly empathizes with the idea that the violence enacted in the streets in 1968 after Dr. King was assassinated and that destroyed her own neighborhood constituted a pursuit, at least, of affirmation. With the shoes that were different sizes and different colors, this figure limped with conjured pride in the best way he knew how. Something about the power of claiming the shoes he had always wanted counterbalances, at least to some extent, the scars that come with the acquisition. The combustibility of the American dream is the true flaw here, its discourses and trappings of opportunity denied being the tinder that lights this fire. Riots, or uprisings as they are now often called, are not only public events, in other words. They may be the collective language of the unheard, as Dr. King put it, but they are also habitations for private validation, however compromised or even dubious, incendiary art on an individual level. It is easy to disparage the attribution of such meaning to the commodities born of labor exploitation of people just like the speaker in this poem, and I have certainly done so. But a poem like this opens up the feelings associated with that attribution, that contours of his being, that empty vessel, feelings that exceed materialism into manifesting outwardly the tortured richness within, the shoes, and even the burned hands, becoming a metaphor for the full range of one's inner life, one's desires, ambitions, hungers, vulnerabilities, fears. This is not how I usually think of this kind of act, privileged scholar that I am, but in the face of social death, what's a brother to do? Throughout the book, Smith reinforces this association of violence with the art of affirming oneself in order to confirm the possibilities of a stay against that defeating publicness. There are similarly titled poems of incendiary art for Philadelphia and Move, and for Ferguson. These are juxtaposed with poems about Emmett Till and what he has meant to Black people who were raised with his death as a kind of cautionary tale. She writes poems whose title consists of headlines or summaries of news articles about Black men dying at the hands of the police. These are poems of mourning usually as much as protest, a reminder that the violence of the system produces very real feelings of loss. Indeed, some of the poems are told from the perspective of the deceased, one of which avers that the mother, quote, would not have recognized my voice. There is art to this mourning, a beauty capable of refiguring these obvious versions of social death and anti-Blackness into something like an insistence on existing. As we often say, when we mourn, the departed are still with us because we remember. Isn't that, after all, one of Shakespeare's great legacies? His full-throated endorsement of art's capacity to immortalize? Smith asks us to consider the nature of the enduring mourning that obtains when we remember those killed violently and unjustly. What flames of feeling, of self-assertion, of consciousness of our full being, consciousness of our complicity can arise with an incendiary art of protest. Don't just attend to the protest, recognize the full consideration of the full meaning of the incendiary art, the full sense of where those uprisings come from, their causes, effects, injuries, and affirmations. Shockley is similarly engaged in this art of confrontation, but her focus is often on the language itself. Part of what Smith's poem conveys just how powerfully our conventional language of social change and of mourning can mask as well as illuminate the modes of assertive being manifest in such dissidence. Shockley takes up those conventions directly, revealing explicitly how language can render Blackness a sign of absence, and how reworking that language can assert a kind of Black being, a fugitive being within it. Shockley is quite eloquent on her own approach, so I will quote her at length. In one interview, she was asked about her wordplay in a poem, and she replied, quote, "My work in a poem, like playing with fire, is to put readers in the position to be blindsided by all that linguistic cultural baggage, the way I'm blindsided by it in various contexts, poetic and otherwise. We feel the operation of language in these situations, as we might not feel it when words are spooling out in ways that we can see coming, so to speak." Later in the interview, she elaborates on her use of the character Topsy from the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in ways that apply to her poems more generally. I think of these strategies as invitations or doorways into the poems and into conversation with my ideas. For example, by placing a character who originates in Uncle Tom's Cabin within a world created by Lewis Carroll and drawing upon language from both of these earlier texts, I can create a pathway from something a reader may already be familiar with to ideas or situations or meanings they hadn't considered. And sometimes, of course, the poems might lead readers to my source texts, which is also important as we are again, or still, confronting the importance of our history to our present. When I say history, I want that to mean not only past events, as with political or social history, but also our literary and intellectual history. Art is one place where we can bring together things that are not usually simultaneously in view. How does it change the way one might hear the Texas State Troopers characterization of Sandra Bland in 2015 if you think about it in light of a particular history of characterizations of Black girls and women, one that goes back a few hundred years at least, and makes an important appearance in the racial imaginary of a white Northern abolitionist woman, which I think she means Harriet Beecher Stowe. Confronting the racial imaginary is what Shockley is up to in a poem, That's a Rap, sheet music for Alphabet Street, from her volume Semi-Automatic. She offers insights into what is in, around, and outside of that imaginary, what might, as Moten put it, be the stealth of the stolen, the fugitivity that escapes every enclosure. If I sang the blues, would that be new or new? Would booze follow blues? Would blood follow? Bud flower, flow, sang-froid, cold-blooded, hot-blooded, male? If I sang frigid, would that be cool? Jazzy? Jizz, buzz, the word. Do I have the right to write the right body to remain silent, habeas corpus, to have the remains dans my main, my main man, handyman, unhand me, uncuff me, so I can speak in my sign language, signifying language, signs, wonders, miracles, temptations, 3 or 4 tops, hip hops, micro brouhahas, address them and drop the mic. Ain't nothing new, son, about us being under the gun. Checked in the black box, never a dull minute. Oh, pen it, mighty muse, flighty music, put the light letters together, take it away. Shockley is quite a punster when it comes to public language, calling attention to the habits of mind that are reflected and reinforced by the cliches we use, sometimes deadening us to what is most alive in language and thus in other people. Listing words based on sound associations elides that syntax of their logical relations, but evokes other logic nonetheless. Consider how easily you filled in the blanks between write as a ritual and write as scribe. Did you consider what it means to have a ritual by which to write a body? What is the relationship between performance and logos? And what does it mean to write a body anyway? Except to write over it maybe, with the language of assumptions and stereotypes that attend perceptions of a given body. When what came to you when you realized, if you realized, that wonders, miracles, temptations, and even tops are all names of R&B musicians? What is the relationship between those musicians and the connotations of their names except for the marvel of their moving our bodies? I, for one, feel great pleasure and kinship with the poet when I get her references and enjoy calling to my own attention the ease with which I filled in the blanks between right body to remain silent and habeas corpus. I watch Law and Order, after all, and know that while that phrase indicates how individual citizens have the right to control their own bodies, that same phrase also indicates that the government, the state, has the authority to move your body too. Bodily movement to the wonders and temptations is about self-possession then. Martha and the Vandellas singing about dancing in the streets as both partying and protesting. There is an emotional depth within and masked by some of these associations. The poet wants to invite us to join her in unpacking them, moving in and around and through how language renders Blackness a sign of absence in order to see that presence again. And we must certainly confront all of our habits of mind, including what we want poetry to be. Shockley is among a cadre of poets who think that the traditional lyric sometimes does too much work for us as readers, and that poems like these insist upon the responsibility and the freedom to make meaning with the poet, not to subordinate our senses to the ways in which those profound and beautiful lyric poems might reinforce what we already know, spool language at us in ways that we can see coming. Shockley offers poems in the rest of the volume that use similarly associative procedures like this one to challenge and complicate our semi-automatic ways we respond to language and the roles that they sometimes write us into. For example, she has a poem that visually resembles nutrition information one finds on food, but revised to indicate the nourishing ingredients of Black womanhood. Other poems take Topsy, the racist buffoon little girl from Uncle Tom's Attic, in which a self-assertive female speaker claims her power in a poem in which each line begins with the letters of the alphabet in order, 26 lines, A to Z. There are a couple of one-act plays in the shape of prose poems and other poems that adopt public language even more explicitly. My favorite is Supply and Demand, in which Shockley takes popular cliches about money and substitutes the phrase Black boys. So you get the poem's opening lines, quote, "The more Black boys you have, the more you want. You act like you're swimming in Black boys. You can't keep Black boys in your pocket." And it ends, of course, "Black boys don't grow on trees." What a powerful way to think about the relationship between human value and commodity value, to distinguish what matters most about the human being, that ineffable, unexchangeable excess, and the travesty of its being mistaken for exchange value. And there is even a poem called Senzo that articulates the emotional motivations Shockley imagines to obtain behind the 2008 piano album of that name by Abdullah Ibrahim, the title of which means ancestor, and which is also the name of Ibrahim's father. artistic, cultural, and intellectual history as excess of beauty and artistic. Gorman has a mantra that she recites every time that she goes on stage, and it strikes me as a powerful way to sum up this engagement of how public and private Blackness can become productive of powerful art and possibilities of justice. She tells herself, quote, "I am the daughter of Black writers who are descended from freedom fighters who broke their chains and changed the world. They call me." Framing oneself in a family history in this way offers an incisive way to rewrite, or at least to reframe, the afterlife of slavery into a context for empowerment and beauty, for the kind of existential movement that I think finds answers to all of that discourse of social death. As I read poets like Smith and Shockley, and as I recall the struggles and persistence and perseverance of poets like Wheatley, I am ready to embrace Gorman's optimism that one can read in her yellow coat and in the rousing conclusion in her poem. Our people diverse and beautiful will emerge, battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leonard. We have a couple of people who posted in the Q&A just saying hello and thank you for doing this webinar. I would like to echo those sentiments. And I just wanted to remind everyone who's attending that Dr. Leonard has agreed to give us his slides. So if you would like to refer to anything he spoke about today, you'll be able to refer back to the slides. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. You'll find that if you're on a desktop at the bottom of your Zoom window, the Q&A icon, or if you're on a mobile device, just gently tap your screen and the Q&A icon will appear. Okay, we do have our first question. This person is wondering if you could say a few words about Afrofuturism. Do you think Amanda Gorman is it, and what might be its limits?
That's a complicated question. So Afrofuturism is often defined primarily as a using of the relationship between race, Black heritage, technology, and visions of the future to rethink how African Americans can engage in the society, that you use things like space, outer space imagery, or thinking about Black bodies in relationship to technology, and rethink those, like Janelle Monáe's music and her myth about Cindy Mayweather being a cyborg from the future, an android from the future who's going to liberate her people from enslavement. And so part of the emphasis on technology in Afrofuturism, I think, would not necessarily make Amanda Gorman part of that. But I think part of what some people like to do when they talk about Afrofuturism is to emphasize the idea of Black speculative futures, ways of reimagining the future from different perspectives without necessarily emphasizing the technology and sci-fi aspects of it. I think because of the way that Amanda Gorman places herself in history and projects herself as a voice of the future, one can talk about her speculating on that in certain kinds of ways. What are some of its limitations? I think people have questioned whether certain manifestations of Afrofuturism are too utopic. It is, you can imagine with an inauguration poem, given her sensibility, that she would want it to be positive and inspiring and to lift us up and say, we can be the light if we're brave enough to be the light. And so projecting into the future that way lends itself to the kind of utopia which looks a lot like the present, so that our imagining of what the future can be isn't that much different from now, and we can get trapped into that idea or sensibility as opposed to really transforming it. And so if one wants to critique the optimism or to see that optimism as being too utopic, you can identify certain limitations that way. Or you can imagine that part of what futurism does is give us language to think about the difference between a proposed future and our present as a critique of our present. And I suspect that Gorman would be more aligned with that latter view. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. We have a comment from another attendee. Again, thanking you for the presentation. This person doesn't have a question, just a comment that they are thrilled to see Ms. Smith featured as a primary subject. Is there a particular reason you chose that poet to feature tonight?
Well, at first, my first thought was because of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize, that these two poets coming from a certain kind of explicitly political sensibility, I was struck by the fact that they were, in fact, co-runners up to that Pulitzer Prize. But the other part of it is, I think that Patricia Smith, because she had her start in spoken word and performance poetry, it's very interesting to think about the kind of public nature that spoken word poetry claims for itself. Even though some of the open mics and some of these slam competitions are in localized venues and don't necessarily have a big public, the sensibility of all of those venues is that their artists, their writers, their poets are engaged in the politics of the now. Not all spoken word poets do explicitly political protests or of that kind of work, but it is a predominant sensibility. And so having sharing Smith poems, one in which she's doing it in the traditional spoken word venue, another having her read her poem in print, I think is a way of thinking about a kind of continuum of engagement with one's public perception, kind of resist various versions of that public perception using different kinds of poetic forms and venues to do so. And plus, she's just dynamite to listen to.
Okay, we have a follow-up question. Can you talk a little bit more about the violence as a subject in 1968 versus the demonstrations we see today? And does Patricia Smith approach these time periods differently in her poetry?
That's a really interesting question. It's a very interesting question. I'll start with this, that in incendiary art, there are several poems called incendiary art, including one that refers to the violence that happened in protests after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And so she, I think, offers similar kinds of sensibility about the intersection between something like Goldblatt's store and how that embodies the impressive state apparatus and capitalism, the ways in which, even though the store provides access to patient layaway tickets, doesn't really provide you access to the good life. And so those kinds of manifestations that become the targets of violence, she represents similarly in her poem, Incendiary Art, about Ferguson. So I think that she would see a lot of parallels there. One of the things that's striking about the different moments, I can say off the top of my head, would be a couple of things. One is the 1968 version of it is in response to the assassination of this beloved leader who was perceived by most as getting things done, and his inspirational speaking, his inspirational figure was the spur, the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. It's interesting to juxtapose that with something like what happened after Ferguson or what happened after the killing of George Floyd, in which ordinary citizens are now, the killing of ordinary citizens become the prompt or the spur for these large scale movements, not all of which are intended to be violent. As we know, not more than 90% of all of the protests of Black Lives Matter protests are nonviolent. But the ones that do turn violent, I think we can talk about similar things, because it is so often stores that become the targets of these, not only because they represent all kinds of things that we're excluded from, the poor job that you couldn't get, the material that are more expensive than you can afford, the mom and pop store that got removed by the target, but they also have similar incidences of looting. And so I think there are some interesting parallels to be made. I would have to think more about it and see if there are other instances where Smith talks about the difference. Off the top of my head, the only one I can think of is that poem about Ferguson, and the parallels I think she makes very strongly, with the emphasis on this time it's an ordinary person's death that sparks the protest.
Thank you. The next question is from a person who's struck by how well Smith and Shockley speak to our current moment. They would like to know, is there a deceased poet who you think speaks with new freshness and urgency to us?
That's an interesting question. I I'm sure that you know, given who's asking the question, that James Baldwin has been speaking with great urgency to people these days. And so he's, you asked about a poet, but I focused on Baldwin because he comes to mind immediately. I do know that I had an interesting experience in my literature course a couple of weeks ago teaching poems by Gwendolyn Brooks, and was struck by how students read them differently. A poem by Brooks about the protests and violence having to do with the integration of schools after the Brown versus Board of Education decision has often been read as being about Brooks lamenting the impossibility of full, genuine integration. These students read that poem as a warning against the limiting possibilities of integration, that Brooks was aware that it wasn't worth the violence, that the kind of integration you get was about losing too much of yourself. So I don't know that Brooks herself necessarily speaks more to our times, but I do think that poets like Brooks, who write kind of realistically and directly about the Black community, their voices can be enriched and heard for the now. But I'll have to think about that. If someone else comes to mind, I'll definitely drop their name. Thanks for the question.
That's all the open questions we have at the moment. I would just like to remind our audience that we do have about 5 minutes left. If you have any last minute questions, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A. In the meantime, I will just give you a few reminders about what we have coming up. Next month, the library will be celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So we have a number of events on the calendar, especially a 3-week series on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. starting on May 11th that are presented on Korean heritage and Korean language, including raising bilingual children, how you can be a bilingual speaker, and learning a little bit of how to speak and write Korean. So please take a look at our events calendar for more information. We have another question. This person is wondering, what other contemporary Black poets should we be reading?
The first name that comes to mind is Danez Smith, D-A-N-E-Z Smith, wonderful poet. Recent book called Homie, H-O-M-I-E. I would also recommend Damaris Hill. Her book is A Bound Woman is a Dangerous Thing. I think I've gotten that title correctly. I love the work of Giovanni Singleton. And I would also recommend the poetry of, oh, his name just ran out of my head. His book is called Olio, and he just, Tyehimba Jess, T-Y-E-H-I-M-B-A Jess, J-E-S-S. And those are the ones that come to mind. I also always enjoy the work of Natasha Trethewey, who's more famous, and as is Kevin Young. But those are the names that I would be recommending right now. Oh, and Khadijah Queen.
Thank you. That's an extensive list. So, and thank you for spelling out some of the names. If there are any other questions, please drop them into the Q&A. But otherwise, I will thank Professor Leonard for being here tonight. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us a glimpse into this life, this public life of poetry. It's very informative, and we're just getting a lot of people putting into the Q&A thank yous for the presentation as well, echoing those sentiments.
Well, thank you very much, Megan, for the invitation. It was a great pleasure. And thank you all for attending the talk and asking such wonderful questions. I really appreciate it. It was a great experience for me too. And I look forward to engaging sometime in the future.
All right, thank you all for joining us, and we will hopefully see you at our next webinar. Have a good night, everyone.